know now, the work you're doing at Rowe. And I think it might be interesting to sort of kind of a little bit step by step how you got there, but in reverse order. I know one of the big inspirations for Rowe came from your previous position. Can you just say a little bit sort of what you were doing before Rowe and what gave you the idea that we really needed a global learning library for education?
Sure. I was, for a relatively short period of time, president of the One Laptop Per Child Foundation. Nicholas Negroponte persuaded me to join the group. He was going to do the production side, and I was supposed to do the education side. It became painfully clear, relatively early in my career at One Laptop Per Child, that we had different ideas of how to transform education in the world. Nicholas felt, and I think still feels, that getting the hardware out there, everything else will solve the problem, and I felt that the human side and the pedagogical side, if you will, was really critical. And for us simply to repeat the current industrial model was not going to work. And so we parted ways, and I had the good fortune of being able to get free rent in this building.
Nothing's free.
Actually, there's a story there too. So how is it that you ended up getting free rent? What was the original what was the original connection that led you to be involved with Cambridge Innovation Center?
Well, I think I had some chips at some point.
Yeah. So maybe I have to tell this part of the story. So when I was setting out to create Cambridge Innovation Center, we started across the street at 238 Main Street, the Clock Tower building, in a very small space, about 3,000 square feet, maybe twice the size of this room. And we had the opportunity to grow into this building. The 14th floor of this building was our first sort of large floor. And I didn't have the dough to do it. And at the time, my dad was running a startup. Oh gosh, doing this in reverse is going to be really hard. But he was running a startup called Rowe.com. And Rowe.com was an online resource for libraries to get access to journals, scientific, medical, and technical journals. They could subscribe to them. They could get databases also to get articles that way. It was doing rather well. And so my dad was in a position to lend me the money to start Cambridge Innovation Center.
Took it public.
He did take it public. So he lent me the money to start Cambridge Innovation Center. A few months later, I was able to raise venture capital to grow CIC more, and I paid him back that money. Essentially the capital to get this going, the very first capital came from Dad. And as a result, when he was starting his nonprofit, he said, "Hey, I think, maybe there's a little quid pro quo." And so Ole became the only client at CIC that doesn't pay rent. That's continued to this day. I think the actual dollar value of the two is wildly in his favor. If you compare for 17 years of free rent versus that. But who's counting? The story is my dad was working at One Laptop Per Child Foundation, or otherwise known as the $100 Laptop Project, if you remember this. And the basic notion that I thought was really interesting at the time was a laptop back then was more like the normal ones were more like $500 or $1,000. Really, $1,500 a Mac was like probably almost $2,000. And Nicholas looked at the parts and looked at the math of this and said, we ought to be able to do this for $100. And so it was revolutionary. The idea was if you got the hardware price point down that low, then maybe we could start taking some of the benefits of digital technology and spreading it to the world. It was really visionary. And they really did it. I think at the end it was maybe $200 really, or something. $220 was about as cheap as they were able to get that. Partly because they were doing it in relatively low volumes, right? It was this sort of specialized thing, really for education, the education market. And it didn't run any of the standard operating systems, so it's kind of quirky, which made it a little smaller as a market. But in that process, what they figured out, like I think Brazil ordered, these for like every kid in Brazil or something like that. It was a lot, right?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Maybe
right.
millions of units or something
Right,
like
right.
that. And so they had this opportunity and experience to be able to see what it would mean if you put digital technology in the hands of lots of folks. And as is so often the case with innovation, whenever you solve one problem, what it really does is open the box to discover what the next problem is behind that. And it turned out that solving the hardware problem was a very important problem to solve, but it just really opened the question of, well, really, what are we going to do? What software are we going to run on these devices that are going to make them useful for people in the world in general, and particularly in the developing world? And so that was the particular problem that my dad decided to focus on, as I recall, in building Open Learning Exchange. That particular One Laptop per Child episode in your life followed, I think, pretty much directly the Rowe.com experience that we talked about. Is that right?
Well, there was the Dean campaign that came.
Oh, that's right. Yes. So everyone remember Howard Dean? So there was an interlude where Howard Dean ran for president. He did very well and was really a very exciting candidate, I think, for many of us. Kind of a precursor to Barack Obama as we started to see some of the more progressive candidates getting closer to the White House. So what was the role? Can you tell me?
I was the director of the Internet and Communications team for the Dean campaign. The one that started all this meetup stuff and so forth.
And am I right that was maybe the first presidential campaign that
Absolutely.
really had an internet?
Absolutely, yeah.
Significant internet piece?
I have a continuing relationship all that time with Meetup because they were one of the big pieces, and also just raising money. If you remember the bat? Well, you don't remember the bat. Well, I would paint this baseball bat up to the point of midnight when we got the goal that we met.
And you had the picture of this online?
Picture of the bat online. I still have one. But anyway, yeah, I like to think I've kind of herded cats or something in that team. To say I was director, that was simply my title. In fact, the work was done by a lot of college kids who didn't pay that much attention to me anyway, but they got a lot of work done. So that was in between.
So I'm struggling with the reversed order of chronology. Somehow building the story backwards is difficult for me. So I'm gonna actually start a little bit, even kind of at the beginning. You're hearing that this guy was a pioneer, led the internet campaign for the first presidential campaign that did internet, went on to lead a big part of the $100 laptop project, and then now with Open Learning Exchange, you've heard what he's doing. You, by the way, may not know that OLE is the only organization now to have won the MIT Solve competition twice which is a wonderful achievement. And that is a collaboration between MIT and the United Nations to identify technologies that have the potential to really change the world. So this is a remarkable achievement. But you didn't. So you're a technology guy now in many people's minds, and an internet guy. But you didn't start out this way. And I think many people would be surprised to hear sort of where you started your life. Where are you from? And how did you get here? Let's start at the beginning.
Well, I'm an Iowa farm boy.
Really?
Right. Yeah. I spent a lot of my time my grandparents ran a farm. I spent a lot of time on. My father was a Methodist minister.
And his father.
His father was, and we lived in small little towns in Iowa for my youth, and I spent a lot of time on the farm. And I think a lot of my technology came from fixing fence and doing other things to animals that I won't mention.
That doesn't sound good.
But anyway,
Chickens, right?
The point was that I learned that when there's a problem, you fix it. You got a problem, you fix it. You just fix it because you're the one that's there, and you fix it, and you don't pass it off to somebody else. And it's that sense of I like to look at every problem as an opportunity. So I really call it an opportunity, even though most people would call it a problem. And just even labeling it opportunity really makes a really interesting difference.
You can take a big breath right now as you're thinking about your problems. They're not problems, they're opportunities.
Well, I mean, I'm serious about that. I'm serious about that because it enables you to reframe it as something that can be solved, all right? Instead of reframing it as something that can't be solved. Whenever I lose anything, which I do sometimes, I say to myself repeatedly, it does exist. It is somewhere. It hasn't disappeared from the world. And just framing it that way makes a huge difference. So my background, you know, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. My PhD is in clinical psychology. So
I was going to get there, but go on.
you were going to get there. Anyway, so carry on.
So an Iowa farm boy, his grandparents had one of the first telephones in their neighborhood, and that was back when there were party lines. And so everybody, if you picked up the phone, you heard all of the neighbors' phone calls at the same time, which apparently led to quite a lot of hilarity. This is really the only convenient way to communicate.
We were two longs and a short.
So you rang, like that.
That was
And if you're interested, that very telephone from my great-grandparents' farm is now in the lobby at Lab Central, just down the street. Because you may know that Lab Central is where the one end of the very first telephone call ever. That was Thomas Watson's lab, was 700 Main Street, where Lab Central is now today. And Alexander Graham Bell's lab was at 109 Court Street, which is near the CIC 50 Milk location in Boston. And the original wires, they borrowed some telegraph wires that were running over the bridge here. They were already there for telegraph, and they got permission to use those wires and hooked up their new telephone apparatus at both ends, and were able to make the first telephone call between two buildings ever. So in any case, if you go to Lab Central, as a sort of harkening back to this, we recovered the phone from the Rowe farm and installed it on the wall there. So for the Iowa farm, I believe your family moved to Salt Lake when you were young. Your father was a Methodist minister in